You weren't turned into the family scapegoat because you were difficult. You were scapegoated because you noticed what everyone else agreed not to see. Not because you confronted anyone. Not because you attacked the system. Not because you wanted conflict. You just saw the pattern. And the moment a family realizes you can see the pattern, you are no longer a child. You are no longer sensitive. You are no longer misunderstood. You are a liability. You feel it before anything is said. The room tightens, just slightly. Someone pauses. Someone watches you more closely than before. You haven't spoken yet. But something has already shifted. You notice the lie forming. You consider saying something. Then you swallow it. Not because you're unsure, because you've learned what happens next. That's not imagination. That's not anxiety. That's not you reading too much into things. That is a system recognizing a threat, because awareness destabilizes hierarchy, and families built on denial cannot tolerate witnesses. Once awareness is detected, there is no going back. The damage is already done. They know you see it now, and that's when the real punishment begins. But that's not the darkest part. Not yet. They didn't say it all at once. They let it seep in. You weren't labeled dangerous. You were labeled difficult, negative, dramatic, too much, always causing problems. That was their story. But here's the reality they needed buried. You weren't disruptive. You were accurate inside a system built on denial. And accuracy is intolerable in families that survive by pretending. Watch how the lie forms. You notice a contradiction. Something doesn't add up. A story changes. A mood shifts without explanation. You ask one question, not aggressively, not emotionally, just clearly. And the mood collapses. Not because the question was inappropriate, but because it landed too close to the truth. This is the inversion most people never catch. Silence is rewarded. Truth is penalized. Compliance is framed as maturity. Accuracy is reframed as hostility. You weren't told, don't notice. You were taught something subtler. Noticing has consequences. So awareness gets relabeled. Pattern recognition becomes overthinking. Clarity becomes negativity. Emotional intelligence becomes attitude. And slowly, a narrative hardens around you. If you name tension, you are the tension. If you point out inconsistency, you are the problem. If you remember what happened, you are living in the past. The system doesn't correct what you say. It corrects you. Because correcting the truth would require accountability. But correcting the truth teller is easy. That's how scapegoats are made. Not through misbehavior, but through perception. You weren't punished for being loud. You weren't punished for being emotional. You weren't punished for being wrong. You were punished for seeing something that threatened the agreement everyone else was protecting. And here's the part they never want named. If your attitude disappeared the moment you stopped speaking, it was never an attitude problem. It was an awareness problem. And awareness cannot be trained out. It can only be targeted. They didn't punish you for what you did. They punished you for what you saw. What happened to you wasn't emotional chaos. It was structure. Dysfunctional families don't operate randomly. They operate efficiently. They require specific roles to stay intact. And once you see the wiring, it becomes impossible to unsee. Every closed family system depends on three functions. One denier, the one who controls reality. What's allowed to be true, what's dismissed, what's rewritten. One enabler, the one who maintains peace, smooths, minimizes, redirects, keeps things calm by keeping things quiet, and one container for shame, the person who absorbs what the system cannot tolerate seeing in itself. That role is never assigned randomly. Here's the pivot most people miss, and it's the one that explains everything. What they called your attitude was never the problem. The problem was what your awareness did to the structure holding them together. Because awareness destabilizes systems built on denial, not emotionally, structurally. Families like this don't survive on honesty. They survive on homeostasis. The system will protect familiarity at all costs, even if that familiarity is dysfunctional. Truth threatens balance. Clarity introduces movement. Awareness breaks equilibrium. So when one person starts noticing patterns, connecting dots, remembering what was said last time, the system doesn't adapt. It attacks the variable it cannot control. That variable was you. You connect dots they refuse to look at. You go quiet, and suddenly they're watching you. Not because you're dangerous, because you're unpredictable. And unpredictability is lethal to systems that require silence to function. Here's how the mechanism works. The denier cannot tolerate exposure. The enabler cannot tolerate disruption. So the pressure has to go somewhere. It gets redirected, not onto the behavior, not onto the structure, onto the person whose awareness threatens to collapse it. That's how scapegoating begins. Not because you were weak, but because you were aware. The system doesn't ask, why are they seeing this? It asks, how do we neutralize the threat? And the most efficient answer is this. Make the aware one the problem. Label them, pathologize them, isolate them. Because once the group agrees you are the issue, the system can breathe again. The tension lifts, the lie holds, order is restored. Not because anything was resolved, but because the truth has been contained. And this is the moment where everything changes. This is where the scapegoat role is assigned. Once you see this, you can't go back to pretending it wasn't deliberate. Here's the part that dismantles the last self-blame. You were not born the scapegoat. You did not become it through behavior. You were assigned. Because dysfunctional family systems don't respond to awareness with reflection. They respond with role allocation. Once a system detects someone who can see the pattern, it reorganizes. Not emotionally, structurally. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. 3 roles emerge every time. The golden child, master of image protection. This role exists to prove the system is healthy. They mirror approval. They echo the narrative. They perform stability. They are not rewarded for truth. They are rewarded for not seeing. Their calm becomes evidence that nothing is wrong. Their success becomes proof the system works. You've seen this time and time again. They say nothing and are praised for their maturity. The enabler, responsible for illusion maintenance. This role knows something is off. They feel it. They sense the imbalance. But they smooth instead of confront, redirect instead of name, minimize instead of protect. They say things like, let it go. That's just how they are. Do we really need to do this? Not because they believe the lie, but because disrupting it would cost them safety. They feel the tension. They see the wrongdoing. They make eye contact with you, then look away. The scapegoat, essential for truth containment. This is where you were placed. Not because you were unstable, not because you were aggressive, not because you were difficult, because you could see. You noticed the contradiction. You named the pattern. You reacted where others dissociated. And awareness is radioactive to systems built on denial. So the system needed somewhere to put the truth. It put it in you. Your reactions became the problem. Your memory became the issue. Your tone became the distraction. Not because they were wrong, but because they were inconvenient. How many times have you experienced this? You speak calmly. The room tightens. They praise the quiet lie. They attack the calm truth. And here's the line that collapses the illusion completely. You weren't the weakest. You were the most aware, and that made you the most dangerous. Dangerous to the narrative, dangerous to the hierarchy, dangerous to the comfort everyone else was invested in preserving. So the system did what closed systems always do when survival is threatened. It isolated the variable it couldn't control, you. And once that role is assigned, it becomes self-reinforcing. Everything you do is filtered through it. Everything you say is pre-interpreted. Every reaction becomes proof, not because it is, but because the system needs it to be. And this is where the damage begins to compound, because carrying the truth doesn't just cost you safety in the room, it costs you something far deeper. But here's what it cost you. And this is where most people break. This is the damage no one ever names, because the cost of awareness in a dishonest system isn't dramatic. It's physical. It lives in the body long before it becomes a thought. You didn't leave those environments untouched. You left retrained. Not because you were unsure, but because certainty made you a target. Every time you named something real, it was dismissed, minimized, reframed, or ignored. So your nervous system learned a rule it never forgot. Clarity leads to punishment. Over time, that rule didn't stay external. It moved inside you. You didn't stop seeing. You stopped trusting what you saw. You notice the pattern instantly, then spend hours convincing yourself it's nothing. Not because you're confused, because you were taught that being right costs too much. And then came the vigilance, not awareness, surveillance. You learned to scan faces mid-sentence, track tone shifts, adjust your words in real time, not to communicate better, but to stay safe. Your body learned to read the room before your mind finished the thought. You start a sentence, soften it, add a qualifier, then abandon it entirely. Not because you don't know what you mean, but because you remember what happened the last time you finished the thought. Then there's the guilt, the quietest wound of all. You weren't taught that your actions caused harm. You were taught that your presence did. Your discomfort changed the mood. Your reactions made things hard. Your honesty ruined everything. So guilt attached itself not to what you did, but to being. You apologize before anyone accuses you. You shrink before anyone reacts. And slowly, something more corrosive takes root. You stop knowing the difference between loyalty and self-erasure. You were taught that love meant compliance, that loyalty meant silence, that belonging required disappearance. So every time you chose yourself, it felt like betrayal. Not because it was, but because that's how you were trained to feel. You set a boundary and feel ashamed for days afterward. Let this land. You weren't too sensitive. You were conditioned to associate truth with danger, awareness with exile, self-trust with loss. Nothing about this was accidental, so ask yourself, and don't rush past it. Who taught you that noticing patterns was betrayal? When did telling the truth start to feel dangerous? Who benefited from you staying confused? Because once you answer those honestly, the story you were given about yourself starts to crack, and that crack leads to the moment the system never prepared you for. And then you are forced into an impossible choice, a choice you were never meant to make. Not explicitly, not openly, but structurally. If you stayed, you disappeared. If you left, you were labeled disloyal. There was no version of this where you were allowed to be both honest and loved. That was the trap. Stay, and you learn to edit yourself so thoroughly you no longer recognize your own thoughts. Leave, and the story becomes you're cold, ungrateful, difficult, disloyal. Not because you were, because the system needs a villain when the scapegoat steps out of position. This wasn't a dilemma. It was a rigged outcome. You were offered belonging on the condition that you lie with them, and the price of telling the truth was exile. So you learned to make yourself smaller without being asked. You learned to swallow words mid-sentence, to doubt what you saw, to question your own memory. Not because you lacked courage, but because every time you told the truth, something was taken from you. Approval, warmth, protection. Awareness didn't make you brave. It made you alone. And that's the part most people don't understand. Awareness creates exile. Not because truth is cruel, but because systems built on denial cannot survive witnesses. This is where freedom actually begins, and why it feels like loss. Freedom does not feel like empowerment at first. It feels like grief. Grief for the version of love that only existed if you stayed quiet. Grief for the safety that was conditional. Grief for the connection that required your disappearance. So when you finally step back, when you finally stop absorbing the tension, when you finally choose distance, your body reacts before your mind can explain it. You feel calmer alone, and immediately guilty for it. Because peace was never allowed unless it served someone else. You weren't taught that peace was safety. You were taught that peace was obedience. So choosing yourself feels wrong, even when it's the first time your nervous system can breathe. This is the moment the system loses its grip. Not because you confronted anyone, not because you made a scene, but because you stopped participating. And once you stop participating, the structure starts to wobble, which is why what happens next always looks the same. They don't ask why you left. They decide who you are now that you're gone. And that's where the story turns. This is where the system collapses. Not loudly, not all at once, but predictably. Because the moment you wake up, the moment you stop absorbing the tension, the moment you step back instead of smoothing things over, everything they've been holding down resurfaces. Your silence was never neutrality. It was a shock absorber. It absorbed their anxiety, their resentment, their unresolved anger, their emotional volatility. And when you stopped doing that, the pressure had nowhere to go. So it spilled. This is why things got worse after you set boundaries. Why the tone sharpened. Why the stories escalated. Why you were suddenly portrayed as cruel, unstable, selfish, or cold. Not because your boundaries caused harm, but because your withdrawal released what your silence had been containing. You didn't create the chaos, you revealed it. And systems like this cannot tolerate exposure. So they do what all threatened systems do. They assign blame. They don't ask what changed. They decide who's responsible. And suddenly, the story rewrites itself. You're no longer the sensitive one. You're the problem. You're no longer trying. You're abandoning them. You're no longer honest. You're manipulative. You hear stories about yourself that don't resemble you at all. Conversations you were never in. Motives you never had. They're not confused. They're consolidating power. Because if they can make you the cause of the rupture, they never have to look at what your absence exposed. This is the reframe they never want you to reach. You didn't break the family. You stopped holding it together with your silence. And once the system loses its shock absorber, it panics. It needs someone to absorb the fallout, someone to carry the discomfort, someone to explain why things feel worse now. That someone is always the one who left the role. So they turn on you harder, rewrite history more aggressively, and tighten the narrative around your supposed failure. Not because you changed, but because you're no longer available to keep the illusion intact. And this is the part they never want you to understand. Here's the reversal that collapses the story you were handed. You were never the scapegoat because you were broken. You were scapegoated because you reflected the truth they couldn't survive seeing. Play that again. Systems don't attack what's weak. They attack what's dangerous. And danger, in families like this, isn't anger. It isn't rebellion. It isn't confrontation. It's perception. You noticed patterns they worked to keep invisible. You remembered what they rewrote. You reacted where they needed numbness. You stayed oriented to reality in a system that survived on distortion. That made you unmanageable, not difficult, perceptive, not disloyal, awake, not isolated, uncontrollable by the old rules. You didn't threaten them by being loud, you threatened them by being accurate, because accuracy strips narrative control, and narrative control is the only power these systems have. That's why the response was never proportionate. That's why your tone was dissected instead of their behavior. That's why your memory was questioned instead of their actions. You weren't corrected. You were contained. Here's the exposure they never want named out loud. They needed you small because your clarity made them look exactly as small as they were. Not powerful, not authoritative, not misunderstood. Small, fragile, dependent on silence and performance to survive. So they attacked the mirror. They mocked it, discredited it, turned others against it. Not because the mirror lied, but because it showed too much. And once you see that, the guilt loses its grip. Because betrayal was never telling the truth. Betrayal was what they demanded instead. You weren't the family problem. You were the family threat. And threats don't get reasoned with. They get neutralized. Families like this don't fall apart when you leave. They fall apart when they can no longer blame you. As long as you were there, the tension had a container, the dysfunction had a location, the story had a villain. You. Once you're gone, the cracks don't disappear. They spread. That's why your absence felt threatening. Not because you mattered less, but because without you, the lie had nowhere left to stand. You weren't rejected for being too much. You weren't pushed out for being difficult. You weren't discarded for failing to belong. You were rejected for what you exposed. And exposure is unforgivable in systems that survive on denial. So tell me now, who punished you for noticing what was obvious? No explanation needed. No backstory required. This isn't a video you watch once. It's one you recognize yourself in, slowly. You'll hear a line now that won't fully land until later. Until a look, a joke, a silence, a moment that feels familiar and suddenly isn't confusing anymore. That's when you'll remember this. Because once you can see the pattern, you don't lose it. You start noticing it everywhere. And the reason this stays with you isn't because it hurt. It's because it named something you were trained not to trust. So if this felt unsettling, if you already feel yourself replaying scenes, if someone's face crossed your mind while watching, that's not coincidence. That's recognition. Watch it again if you need to, before you walk back into the room, after you leave it, or years later, when the story finally clicks. And if you know someone who always carried the blame without ever being cruel, send it quietly. Some truths don't need explaining. They just need to be seen. Truly seen.